So I recently had an interesting conversation with my sister, and I had an interesting realization as a result of it. I was visiting family during Christmas, and my sister and I, who are both apostates, so we were both raised in a very devout Catholic family, and we were both devout Catholics ourselves growing up, and we realized that as non-Catholics, Catholic symbolism is much more meaningful to us than it was when we were actually practicing. And the reason for that is that our experience of the symbols is not constrained by the dogma. And what I mean by that is, in Catholicism, there's this whole body of doctrine that you're required to believe to remain, a good Catholic. And there's an official approved interpretation for, biblical stories, for the Mass, what the symbolism means, who the Virgin Mary was, what she means symbolically and, literally. And you're really not supposed to stray outside that interpretation. Now, you're permitted some leeway with interpretation as long as you don't contradict the dogma. And there's this great fear among a lot of, serious Catholics that of straying outside the box, the circumscribed box of dogma in your interpretation and therefore your experience of, religious symbolism or religious ritual. And so what you end up doing is you either come to a religious ritual or religious symbolism and you try to have the right thoughts, the approved dogmatic interpretation of what you're experiencing. Or, you come to it, and if you find your thoughts, straying to, in directions you may not have anticipated, then, there's a lot of anxiety around that. And you may try to bring your experience back to, something that's approved. And so it really hampers your ability to, I think, connect emotionally with the symbols. And I think it's something that was responsible for our own spiritual dryness is the actual term that a lot of Catholics use, where you're praying, you're going to Mass, maybe you're saying the Rosary, you're contemplating, you're meditating on a mystery of Christ's life or something like that. And you just don't feel like you're getting anything out of it. You just don't feel like you're connecting with it, like it's really meaningful to you. And it's a very common experience. And what we found is once we left all of the dogma behind, all of a sudden the symbols spoke to us meaningfully. She found that she has rediscovered a love for the Blessed Virgin and what the Blessed Virgin symbolizes and means. And I found myself, falling back in love with the Mass and with the gestures and the symbolism and the whole ritual of it. And it's because we're allowing these things to speak to us in a free, more spontaneous way. And it got me thinking about what dogma is and what psychological function dogma plays and what symbolism is and what psychological function it plays. And I think they play two opposing psychological roles. And to illustrate what I mean by that, let's think about what dogma is. So dogma is not just a belief that you hold. It's not just, when someone's dogmatic, we don't just think of someone who has a very strong conviction. We think of someone who is actually afraid to consider alternatives to the dogma. They get angry, they get anxious, or they shut you down. They're not allowed psychologically, or they're not allowing themselves to consider alternate possibilities, even hypothetically. And why is that? Why would they do that? Well, it's because a dogma is a belief that is designed to suppress or repress, or it's not necessarily designed, but it's used to suppress or repress some sort of uncomfortable psychological content, an emotion you don't want to feel, a reality you'd prefer to evade. There's something that you feel as a threat to you that you can't face. And the dogma is actually clinging to the dogma. We describe it as clinging because there's that anxiety to it, is a way of avoiding something uncomfortable. And that's why, we describe people as dogmatic people as inflexible. It's not because they have a really strong conviction. It's because of the fear that goes along with being dogmatic. And this is one of the reasons that people who are truly dogmatic will even cut other people off, cut off friendships if people disagree with them. I've experienced this personally. And the reason for that is your disagreement with a dogmatic person threatens their sense of psychological safety. And you actually become a vessel for their negative projections. Because what happens is your mere presence reminds them of the thing that they want to avoid. And so they end up projecting that thing onto you, just as an inevitable psychological consequence. So what is a symbol and what is its psychological function? So a symbol is, any concrete object, any concrete thing that stands for something else, usually an abstract idea, but not always. And in a religious or artistic context, specifically, symbols have a strong connection with the subconscious. Because you can create a symbol consciously. I mean, like the alphabet. A is a symbol that people set out to create to stand for a specific vocalization or group of vocalizations. But very often, symbols speak to the unconscious and come from the unconscious. So, for instance, you might be doodling or, just going about your day, and an image might pop into your mind. And for some reason, it holds some kind of emotional resonance for you. And you may not fully understand why, or you may understand partially. Or you might see something. You might see an image like a painting or, a religious statue or something like that, and it touches you. And you don't necessarily know exactly why, but it feels meaningful. You think to yourself, that means something, even if I don't exactly know what it is. And the reason for this is because, we all have subconscious content. We can only hold a certain number of things in, our conscious awareness at one time. But the things that we've experienced or the things that we know don't just go away if we're not keeping them top of mind. We don't have to relearn something, after it goes out of our awareness. It's still there in the back of our mind, and there's this huge repository of content that is connected to all kinds of other content in interesting and murky ways in many cases. And so, subconscious content can be brought into awareness by a symbol that in some way corresponds to it. In some way, our subconscious mind makes a connection between the symbol and, some sort of content that we have. And so symbols have the exact opposite function of dogma. Whereas dogma disconnects, symbols connect. And I think it's very fitting that symbols, the word symbol comes from the Greek word symbolon, which means to bring together. So symbols bring together your conscious and your subconscious mind. And that's really the purpose of spirituality in general. It's self-knowledge. It's to connect the conscious and the subconscious. And so if you're only engaging with a symbol, according to some pre-approved dogmatic box, you're really missing out on the richness of what that symbol can actually offer you. And in a way, you could really be stunting your own spiritual and psychological growth. And I think that's really the thing that I've learned, since leaving Catholicism. And I'm immensely grateful for what I've experienced, for how meaningful the symbols have become for me as a result of leaving aside the dogma. Now, this isn't to say that your subconscious is full of some higher wisdom that is superior to reason. But it is to say that your subconscious is full of information about yourself. It's full of data. And while you do need to bring a systematic, rational philosophy to bear on that data, the data itself is important to dredge up. In fact, it's absolutely vital.